Hello again. This is our story of the Old Testament. This is session 10. We're going to be talking about the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. Our last session introduced a very complicated period in the history of Israel and also a very complicated book in the Bible. It's confusing, all the different names and places and people and events. The kingdom of Israel that had been controlled by David and then his son Solomon was no more. It had been divided into two parts. The northern section was eventually taken under the leadership of an individual who was not of the royal line. He was probably an aristocrat or of the nobility, but nevertheless he was not of the anointed line of David. The southern kingdom was taken by what was under the control of Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon. If we look at the map, we can see that the bluish area, which was the kingdom of David and Solomon, had been divided into two parts, the northern part retaining the name of Israel and the southern part retaining the name of Judah. However, they were beset on all sides by rebellions and attacks, and when the dust settled, both kingdoms had been greatly diminished and were surrounded by various kingdoms, tiny kingdoms of Edomites and Moabites and Ammonites and Arameans. As an example, the kingdom of Moab was perhaps 20 miles by 30 miles in dimension. It's a tiny little place, not much bigger than many of the counties in the United States. In addition, Jeroboam had introduced pagan worship and established pagan altars both at the northern end and the southern end of his kingdom. And if we look at the greater picture of the Fertile Crescent, we have Israel and Judah, which have been subdivided into two tiny little kingdoms. The original kingdom of Israel was about the size of the state of Ohio, cut in half. And what has happened now is that each of those has been reduced in size and also in power and the ability to protect themselves. And they are beset by the Arameans off to the northeast, by the Egyptians off to the south, but with continual pressure from the Egyptians, the kingdom of Judah was able to retain some of its autonomy, but then the Assyrians appeared. They had been present in the Fertile Crescent in the eastern end for a couple of hundred years, but they began their expansion on the international stage in the 800s, and they spread all the way to the Mediterranean, eventually destroying the Phoenicians and the Arameans, and eventually taking control of the entire area. We're going to take a look at this moment at the various kings of Israel. I'm going to list them by name. It's a little bit complicated and confusing, but I'm going to just run down through the 19 names of the kings of Israel, and we'll go down through this. If we look at the first, we can return to that slide. There we go, thanks. Jeroboam and his son Nadab were replaced by another man completely of a different line of family, Baasha and his son Elah, and then they were replaced by Zimri, Omri. Omri had a son Ahab and two grandsons, Ahaziah, and Joram. And then came Jehu, who was one of the most important of the northern kings, and he extends his reign into 5 generations before his line is replaced by Shalom, and then Menahem and his son, and finally Pekah, and Hoshea, who is the last king. Now, these 19 kings, during a period of a little more than 200 years, had a very chaotic period of time. All of them practiced what has been referred to as the sin of Jeroboam. Nadab was assassinated after a short time on the throne by Baasha, and then The son of Baasha was assassinated by Zimri, who was burned up in his palace after just a week or two on the throne. It was Omri who eventually took the throne. Ahab died in battle fighting the Arameans. His son Ahaziah fell off a building and was hurt and died. And then the brother, Joram, was assassinated by Jehu. And the family of Jehu survived for a while until Zechariah was assassinated by Shallum, who was assassinated by Menahem, and Pekahiah, who was assassinated by Pekah, and then finally Hosea, the last king of the northern kingdom, was taken into captivity by the Assyrians. This was, as you can see, a very chaotic period of time. I'm going to return to the slide again. There are several that we need to pay attention to. There's Jeroboam. He, of course, was the founder of the line. And then Omri was important because he founded the city of Samaria, so we'll talk about him. Ahab was perhaps one of the worst and most important of the kings of the northern kingdom. And then Jehu, who was anointed by the prophet Elisha, not Elijah. The successor to Elijah was Elisha, and it was Elisha who instructed Jehu to wipe out the family of Ahab. And then finally Hosea, who was the last of the kings. When the Assyrians came in, they had created a tremendous threat to the northern kingdom as well as to the region of the north, but they came in slowly over a period of time. Omri was, let me repeat who a couple of these kings were. Omri was important for two reasons. He built Samaria. He built the city that became a magnificent fortified city built from scratch in a region that was named Samaria after the land. But he's important because he was the first king of the northern kingdom who was mentioned outside of the Bible. It's always important, historically, if we can find a mention of a biblical event or a biblical personage in an outside reference of some sort, and the Assyrians provide us with several of those. Omri is mentioned in two different sources. One's called the Moabite stela, which is like a big tombstone, and then an obelisk that has a picture that I'm going to show you in a couple of moments. If we move on down to his son Ahab, Ahab is important, first of all, because some of the stories of his reign are the most entertaining in this period of time. But we have reference to him in Assyrian records that helps us date his reign and helps us put a more specific time and a chronology to all of the events of the northern kingdom. And then Jehu, there is also an outside reference to him, and between the references to Ahab and Jehu, we are able to put a precise date on events in the middle of the period of the northern kingdom. Now, the Assyrian threat, we're going to turn to, let's take a look at some slides here. The Assyrians were a fascinating people. These are some large carvings that were excavated early on in some of the sites of Assyria. And these large animals, creatures of some sort, would stand on either side of the throne room or into the palace. Here is one of those that has been relocated to the British Museum. It's an Assyrian gate, and you can see that they are very impressive figures. This is a reconstruction of what their throne room might have looked like based upon the archaeological excavation of the time, and you can see the figures to the left and the right of the entrance to the throne room. The decoration, I think, is a little bit over the top, but nevertheless it would have been very impressive to outsiders who were coming to visit the kings of Assyria. The Assyrians were terrible, terrible fighters. They were a professional army. They were extremely brutal. They enjoyed torture, and they collected the heads as a way of counting the number of individuals killed by individual fighters. For example, here is a warrior being rewarded for his efforts in battle, and he has a pile of heads showing the number of men that he killed. Here's another of that relief that shows perhaps the head being removed. And if you look at an additional one here, we have a depiction of impaling, which was a practice that the Assyrian army used. They would place men on a vertical post, and it would be a very horrible way to die. And in addition, they enjoyed torture. This is a depiction of them flaying men alive, removing the skin from living men. And this gives you a sense of the nature of the Assyrian army. When an Assyrian army would attack, obviously, it would be a terrifying event for the cities. It was meant to terrify, and it was meant to cause them to surrender. If they surrendered, they would be taken into slavery. If they showed resistance, they would definitely die, and they would die quite painfully. In addition, the Assyrian army was a professional army. It had military skills that had not been seen in that part of the world in the past. They had sappers who could tunnel under walls and cause the collapse of the various walls. They had battering rams. They had ways of scaling the walls, and as a result, they were a terrible enemy to come against your city. If we look at the maps again, we can see that Assyria extended its influence into the region of modern Syria, but in 853, at a time when they were coming to their greatest power, their king was a man by the name of Shalmaneser, and there was an event that is not mentioned in the Bible called the Battle of Karkar. And in this particular battle, the various Canaanite groups were able in coalition to travel north and fight a huge battle against the Assyrians, probably fought them to a truce, or at least to a standstill. The Assyrians bragged about how they had defeated a coalition army, but it stopped the Assyrian spread into this region for almost 100 years. Ahab the Israelite is mentioned in one of the inscriptions by the Assyrians that depicts this particular battle, and we are able to place the timing of that to 853 BC. So this is an extremely important battle. Ahab fought the battle, and while it's not mentioned in the Bible, it is mentioned in an outside reference, and it helps us to apply a date to the time of Ahab. As it turns out, this is the year he died. He didn't die in this battle. He died shortly after, fighting an additional battle. And if we take a look at the life of Ahab, we can see that the northern kingdom included numerous Canaanite cities, with the Arameans off to the east. We are told that Ahab in the Bible was fighting battles in that region in 857, and these were against the Arameans. And then he helped to at least stop the Assyrian advance at the Battle of Karkar in 853, which is not mentioned in the Bible. And then he was fighting the Arameans again in 853 when he died. When that happened, the Moabite kingdom, this tiny little kingdom off to the east, rebelled against the rule of the northern kingdom, and we have a record of that by a Moabite king. This is called the Moabite Stela, or the Mesha Stela. He was the king of Moab at the time. And what it says on this inscription is that as for Omri, king of Israel, that was the father of Ahab, he humbled Moab for many years, but I have triumphed over him, while Israel hath perished forever. Now that's a bit of an overstatement. Obviously Israel had not perished forever, but we have a reference to the same events in the Bible. Here in the book of 2 Kings, it says, after Ahab died, the king of Moab, meaning Mesha, rebelled against the king of Israel, whose name was at that time Joram, who was the son of Ahab. So we have a neat little reference to an event in the Bible that is also found on a Moabite inscription, and it parallels the historical accuracy of the Bible passage. Now, when Ahab died, he was succeeded by two sons, Ahaziah, was the elder son. He took the throne and fell and was injured and died, and shortly thereafter, his brother Joram was taken to the throne, and he ruled for almost 11 years. Now, during that period of time, Elijah, who had been an individual who had constantly criticized Ahab, Elijah had died and was replaced by his successor, whose name was Elisha. And Elisha was motivated by the Lord to anoint a military officer by the name of Jehu, Jehu, and he was commissioned, Jehu was, to wipe out the family of Ahab. They had been among the worst of the pagan worshipers. Ahab had married the woman who is the epitome of the evil woman. Her name was Jezebel, and she had traveled to the region with hundreds of priests of Baal and Asherah. And Jehu was commissioned to literally wipe out the family of Ahab, all of his descendants, his children, his grandchildren, the various princes, everybody. And this is exactly what he did. He galloped up from the valley and to a place where Joram was picnicking, basically, and he killed him, and then he returned to the town of Jezreel, where Jezebel, the widow, was living, and he had her thrown out of the window of the building. She fell to the ground and was killed. And then he had the princes of the family of Ahab executed, and their heads sent to Samaria and piled up. That was 70 heads of the various princes of the family. And then, while pretending to be a worshiper of Baal, he had all the various priests gathered and into the temple, and then the temple was sealed up, and they were all killed. After he had done all this, he took the throne, but reverted to paganism himself. This is one of those astounding things that happens over and over again during this period of time. We have Solomon, who is actually approached by God and given everything that he wanted, and he reverted to paganism. You have the northern kingdom becoming entirely pagan, and then Jehu, who was put on the throne and commissioned to destroy the paganistic practices of the family of Ahab, reverted to paganism himself. But at any rate, the chronology of Ahab and Jehu allows the fixing of the dates of their reign, and we have a picture of Jehu on what's called the Black Obelisk. This is a pillar. It's about 8 feet tall that was created by Shalmaneser III, and it's laid out almost like a cartoon strip with a bunch of panels on the 4 sides. This particular panel, if it is drawn so that it's a little more identifiable, shows a man kneeling in front of Shalmaneser, and it is described as a representative of the house of Omri. Now, Jehu actually was not of the house of Omri. He was a successor of Ahab. And so this is Jehu who is making an offering to the Assyrian king. And the Assyrians recognized him as a successor to Omri, and so they were suggesting that he was of the house of Omri. Now, the Assyrian threat increased. All of this activity with Ahab and Jehu occurred in the mid-800s, and then things kind of quieted down for a while, and the northern kingdom of Israel was able to continue on without too much interference from the Assyrians, but by the mid-700s, Israel was doomed. The kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, was doomed. If we look at the map, we can see that the Assyrians in the latter part of the 700s, under the kingship of a man named Tiglath-Pileser III, scholars refer to him as TP3, but the Bible calls him Pul. This is one of those translational difficulties that you run into. But Tiglath-Pileser had conquered the Arameans. The Aramean kingdom had been absorbed into Assyria. And then Tiglath-Pileser, in 3 separate summers, had 3 separate campaigns into the south. In 734 BC, he went down the coast, basically destroying the Philistine coast. All of the cities that had been Philistine were conquered, along with the major city of Gezer, which we had talked about before. The following summer, he came down the central portion of the Levant and again conquered major cities such as Megiddo Hatzor and Megiddo, which were two of the most powerful cities that helped protect the entrance into the land. And then in his third season of campaigns, he came down the eastern side in 732, and along the way he conquered the city of Damascus. The one city that he did not conquer prior to that time was the city of Samaria, which was the capital city of the northern kingdom, a major fortified city, and the city of Jerusalem had survived as well. Once again, a major fortified city. Now, within another 10 years or so, Shalmaneser had become king, and in 722, he launched the attack on the city of Samaria. And this was a terrible siege, lasted for 2.5 years. This was one of the longest sieges of ancient cities anywhere. They held out for 2.5 years, but eventually succumbed to starvation and disease. And during the campaign, Shalmaneser died and was replaced by a fellow named Sargon, who is mentioned in the Bible. And the Bible goes on to say that the king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. He captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria, and they are still there. This was the Assyrian practice. They would transplant populations of conquered peoples and replace them with other conquered peoples. And so the king of Assyria brought people from Assyria and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They needed somebody to work the fields, basically. They had killed many of the people, and then they transplanted what was left of the population, so they had to repopulate the area. These people that came in from Assyria worshiped the Lord, it says, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. In other words, they repopulated this area with pagans from other parts of the Fertile Crescent. And with the destruction of Samaria, the northern kingdom collapsed, and Assyria was able to take occupation of the entire area with the exception of the territories still controlled by Jerusalem, and Assyria was now the major power. The region of Judah had been reduced to a territory perhaps 40 miles from north to south and maybe only 20 miles wide. It was a tiny, tiny little area, and unfortunately was unable to protect itself. Now, in 701 BC, they finally launched their attack on Jerusalem. It failed, but nevertheless, they had launched an attack against Jerusalem. We'll talk about that in our next session because that deals with the kings of the south. But the Bible goes on to point out that all this took place because Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. If you wish to take this back an additional generation, it all devolves back onto Solomon's failure. It was Solomon and the sin of Solomon that caused God to decide to have the kingdom divided, but it was Jeroboam who initiated the pagan practices up north, and after 200 years and 19 kings who ruled in chaos, the kingdom was eventually destroyed in its entirety with the Assyrian army, or by the Assyrian army. Now, one other comment here: the repopulation of that region took place around the city of Samaria, and those people were called Samaritans. They had a mixture of religions that kind of came together around the time of the New Testament as a version of Judaism, but it was not. It was a distortion of the faith, and as a result, the people of the Jewish population of the New Testament refused to have anything to do with these Samaritans, and that was the origin of the problem. It was 700 years earlier with the repopulation of the land by the Assyrians. Now, in the next session, we're going to discuss the southern kingdom. We're going to begin with Rehoboam and follow the two kingdoms in parallel, and then we'll take a look at the attack of Jerusalem, the reign of Hezekiah, and the events that were associated with Josiah, and then the eventual destruction of the southern kingdom. And I hope you'll join us for that.
Bible Interact is a group of Bible scholars and biblical archaeologists who promote the Hebraic nature of Scripture and view the two Testaments as one unified message. They explain how they use a first-century approach to searching the Scriptures, and they share their methods and discoveries for discussion and dialogue. They invite your comments and participation on BibleInteract.tv, where you can also find more teachings, self-study quizzes, webinars, and interviews.